Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminally, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, Holly, I've got a review for you of the new Stephen King book. So this book came out last week. As a lifelong King fan, I had a copy of it pre-ordered. It arrived on release day. I started it on release day. I finished it the next day. So the short version of this review is it's really good and definitely worth your time. The longer version of the review is, I think in many ways, it's not a typical Stephen King book. So I want to talk a bit about the reasons why I think it's not a typical Stephen King book in this review. But first, let me tell you what it's about and what I liked about it. So it's a crime novel. And it's a crime novel set against the backdrop of COVID. So it's set in 2021, after the kind of first lockdown has finished and people are trying to start getting back to some sort of normality. And COVID really plays a big part in this book. And it was interesting. It was interesting reading a book set during that period that we all lived through so recently. And whilst this book obviously is set in the US, I think the experience in probably in most countries around the world was quite similar of, an initial lockdown and then, things going back to some sort of normality after that, but still with a lot of kind of COVID protocols in place. So that plays a really big part in this book. As the title would suggest, the central character is Holly Gibney, who's a character King introduced fairly recently in his Bill Hodges trilogy of books, and who subsequently has been in another novel, The Outsider, and in a novella in the collection If It Bleeds. A question a lot of people have asked is, can you read this as a standalone? The answer to that is yes. You can definitely read it as a standalone. But what I would say is, if you're planning to read any of the other books that Holly Gibney is in, and I would suggest you do, because I think they're all pretty good, I would read them in order. So this book certainly spoils some of the things that happen in those other books. So if you're planning to read them at some point, I would read them in order rather than jumping straight into Holly. So yeah, it's a crime novel, and I would call it a suspense novel rather than a mystery novel. And the reason for that is, whilst it's about an investigation, so Holly Gibney is a detective, and in this book she's hired to investigate a disappearance. So the mother of a young woman who disappears hires Holly to look into that disappearance. So whilst Holly is investigating a mystery, we as the reader know what's going on. So right from the start, you know who the bad guys are in this book. And you fairly quickly come to understand what has happened to the girl who's disappeared. So it's not a mystery in the sense of you as the reader trying to figure out what's going on. It's more of a suspense novel. The suspense being, will Holly uncover the mystery and solve it in time? And it's very, very suspenseful. It's a really gripping and enjoyable thriller. As I said, I read it in just over a day. I was completely gripped by it. So the plot essentially is around that investigation, and there are the baddies, if you like, in this book, the villains in this book are a really horrible couple of people who are kind of self-deluded in terms of what they are doing, and their relationship, so they're a couple, their relationship is really interestingly done, and you do feel like they're genuinely a couple who genuinely do love each other, which is bizarre when you are reading some of the horrific things they do. But it's interesting that King chose to do that, chose to give a quite human side to these characters who are, apart from that, absolutely monstrous. Holly continues to be a fantastic character. I believe King has said in interviews that he introduced her just as a walk-on character, but kind of fell in love with her as a character and has kept writing her as a result. And she's a really engaging character. She's one of those detectives who really cares about getting to the bottom of the mystery. That's what drives her. It's trying to help people. And that is, really engaging in this book. And makes it a really enjoyable read. You really care about Holly, and you care that she will solve this mystery. The other characters are really strong as well. So in particular, Barbara, who's a character who's appeared in previous books, who's the sister of a character called Jerome, who's in quite a few of the books. So she has a subplot in this book, which is really interesting. Not really anything to do with the main plot of the book, but really engaging and quite gripping in itself as well. And she plays, an interesting role overall in the kind of development of the story. And you also get from King in this book, as in the Bill Hodges books, kind of musings on aging. So, King, like all of us, King is not getting any younger. He's well into his 70s now, I think. And the Bill Hodges books, which are about an aging detective, very much have, kind of King's thoughts about aging, and you can see him kind of playing out some of those thoughts on the page. This, I think, continues that, but takes it in quite a different direction. So that was interesting to read. And you also, as you tend to get with King's books more and more nowadays, you do get politics in here as well. Now, some people find that a turn off, and I have to say, in Billy Summers, a King book which I read fairly recently, I did think that the political angle of the book was kind of a bit overdone, and it did feel like it intruded on the story to an extent. In this book, the politics is much more confined to discussion around COVID and COVID policy, and it actually feels quite natural given that setting of the book. So I thought that the politics in this book was much less intrusive than it has been in other books, although I would say there is a lot of it. And if you're someone who doesn't believe that COVID was a real thing and doesn't believe that people should wear masks and things like that, then you probably won't enjoy this book. Or certainly it would be a turn off for you. So a gripping thriller, really good characters, a lot to enjoy in this book. I thought it was a really, really fun read. And despite its length, it's about 400 pages long. It just about manages to justify that length. It's, a lot of, I suspect a lot of writers would have taken less pages to tell this story than King does. But King, you kind of have to ease yourself into Stephen King books sometimes, don't you? And you kind of, the fact that you're going to get a few extra pages is kind of priced into your enjoyment of the book or your assessment of the book when you start reading it. So I didn't feel like it was too long, albeit, it's arguably longer than it needs to be. So why did I say at the start then that it's not a typical Stephen King book? I think there's three things about this book that make it slightly unusual for a King book. So the first one is the main characters in this book are all women. And indeed the male characters, there are a few male characters, but they tend to be quite sidelined. So Jerome and Holly Gibney's partner, in the detective agency she works at, actually get quite deliberately sidelined in this book. So things happen to their characters that mean that they can't play an active part in the investigation, which I thought was quite interesting. So it's really Holly and Barbara who are the characters who do all of the heavy lifting in this book, really. And whilst King clearly has written books with female characters before, Carrie, his first book being the most obvious one, he tends to write about men. So I thought it was interesting that that female characters were really front and centre in this book, and I think he does a good job of them as well. I think he does quite a good job of the female characters, and he also does a better job of writing black characters than he has done previously. So Barbara, who is black, I thought was really well done in this book. I think some of the choices King made about the character Jerome, Barbara's brother, in previous books, I felt there was some stuff with Jerome that didn't really work, and it definitely felt like an old white guy writing a young black guy. Whereas Barbara in this book, I thought was much better done. So it's good to see that. That development of King's writing of different kinds of characters. The other thing that's unusual, I think, about this book is that, and I've said this in reviews before, what King often does with books is take two different plots and kind of mash them together into a book. So a good example of that will be The Shining. So is The Shining a book about an alcoholic teacher or an alcoholic writer who gets a job as a caretaker in an isolated motel that happens to be haunted, or is it a book about a young boy who's got psychic powers? It's kind of both of those things, and he manages to take two different plots that other authors might have written two separate books about and mash them into one book. And when King does that well, like he does in The Shining, it makes for an absolutely magical experience. Sometimes he does it less well. The Institute, I think, would be an example of that. So The Institute has two separate plots that felt to me quite clumsily mashed together. In Holly, you don't get that sense. It really does feel like there's really one plot to this book. Now, Barbara does get quite a significant subplot, but it definitely feels like a subplot rather than a secondary plot, if that makes sense. I'm not sure if it does, but it feels like a more traditional handling of narrative. And Barbara's subplot is interesting, but it's completely separate from the main plot, and the book could quite easily exist without it, I think. Albeit I'm glad it was in here because I enjoyed reading it. So that's the second thing that's different. The third thing that's different, and I think this is quite significant, is there's no supernatural elements in this book at all. So even in something like Billy Summers, which is a crime novel about a hitman, doing one last job, even Billy Summers ends up having a supernatural element to it, albeit a very small one. Holly has nothing supernatural at all, which I thought was interesting and quite refreshing. Now, that said, there are definitely horror elements in here. The things that the villains in this book do to their victims are absolutely horrific, but they are definitely human monsters. There's no supernatural or otherworldly element to what they're doing at all. Now, all that said, this does still feel like a Stephen King book. And in particular, there's lots of stuff about writing in this book. So two separate characters in this book are both writing books through the course of it. So you definitely still get that side of King. But as I say, there were some elements of it that did feel slightly unusual for me for a King book. Anyway, the short version, as I said at the start of this review, is it's really good. You should read it. If you're a Stephen King fan, I definitely think you'll enjoy it. And even if you're not a Stephen King fan, I think this is sufficiently different from some of the stuff he normally writes in terms of being a fairly traditional kind of thriller that if you like, crime thrillers, even if you think you don't like Stephen King, you may well have a good time with this book. So do let me know in the comments if you've read Holly already and what you thought of it. And as always, thanks very much for watching. I hope you're safe and well out there. I hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.